Thank you for joining our second webcast for vendor management. Today I'm actually using the um, uh, MetaInformatrack administration server configurator to actually create our first simple vendor. We're actually going to create two, and I'm going to go through high level of what the screens do and what each one of them does, and we're going to go ahead and create a vendor that's a supplier and a vendor that's not a supplier. So once you get actually into the administration tool, and you get your list of stuff depending on how you configured the administration tool itself. I'm logged in as the admin user, so I get almost everything. You can still even control that, but for now I'm just going to click on vendor, and that gets me to the vendor management. These orange VMNG gives you the hint that this is vendor management. Now, most of the stuff that's in these colors has to do with a lot of dialog boxes that you can configure stuff. But when you first get into the vendor management, you actually get into the dashboard. Dashboard has most of the stuff that you need to actually configure a vendor. Um, but let's go ahead and actually, first of all, let me actually show you. I'm just going to show the list. I have some vendors put in here. Um, so I'm just going to show you the list of the vendors I have listed. Again, this is our PV version, so this is actually running in our cloud here locally. But I have 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 5 vendors configured here. We're gonna create 2 additional vendors. One is gonna be a supplier slash vendor. One's gonna be a vendor with that's not a supplier. So the way we do this is you actually click on add vendor, and it will follow the rest of our standard forms where you would enter in the tabs all the information that you have, and then you get to the last step with the finish and save, and then you can save your information. Here's the big thing. Vendor is, if you look at the bottom right here, it says vendor is a supplier, and it's a drop down, and if you're on the Android, it will be at the bottom of the screen. You will say yes or no. So we're going to create, first one we're going to create is a vendor supplier. So we're going to say yes. I have 2 sites configured in this configuration for this demo. I have something called main site, and then I have something called second site. So let's assume there are 2 pharmacies that I own in my business. One I'm going to call the main pharmacy or main site. The other one is the second site. So just to keep things simple, I'm going to add a vendor that's going to supply the main site, and then I'm going to walk you through and actually assign that vendor to all sites, which we will show in a second. But let me go through the dialog boxes here because that's extremely important. And a lot of it, I do recommend, if you're watching this video and have not seen my intro on supplier vendor management, to go ahead and watch that. It gives you a high level logical of how things are organized, what's the difference between a vendor and a supplier, and how we actually, and why they're different from a physical representation. Even in the database, we maintain them a little bit different, and the way we maintain the relationship between the different they're really 2 separate entities, but they can overlap. Okay, so again, I emphasize that if you don't, if you have not seen my previous video, the first one in this series, to go ahead and watch it. It is important because it gives you the logical understanding of what I'm talking about. So since I'm configuring a vendor as a supplier, or a supplier being the vendor, the first one I want to actually look at, there's the label here says ship via. So this is actually the physical method in which you in the pharmacy, in the gift shop, in your store, whatever you use in our system for, because you can actually, for all practical purposes, we're so extensive, you can use us in a restaurant, you can use us all the way into a major grocery store chain. But let's just stick to our niche market, which is the hospitals, gift shops, and maybe cafeterias. But this ship via is actually, how do you actually get items delivered to you? Now, out of the box, we actually give you the standard carriers we know of. UPS, FedEx, USPS, and I think we add Supplier as a default. But all this is configurable. So if you, we've actually added here in the drop-down Uber delivery because that's becoming a thing. If you're running cafeteria, you may have, what is it, Grubhub or something, So you can actually go in and create your own. You can click here and add as many as you want. Okay, if I click it would help. So I can go and add. And by the way, some people have complained to us about the images being, they can't read the text because the image is a bit dark. There is a trick, actually, every dialog box that have a little image to the right of it. If you click on it, it'll actually kill the images behind. And that will actually kill it for the whole session you're running. I actually like our images in the background. I usually run them with them on, but you can actually turn them off. So actually in dialog boxes, once you turn it off, you can't turn it on back from this dialog box. So I usually close, and you can go back up here and you'll see enable BG, enable background, and that will give you the images back. But for high contrast, if you have you have to support, if you have people working for you that have problems seeing or something like that, you can always remove backgrounds and they will go away. But I personally like them, so we got to keep them on for this series. So again, Supplier, it's the way things get delivered to your facility, your site. Okay, you may Supplier may have some other company that does the delivery for them, and that's, or you may have, the supplier may have their own delivery. So you can physically go in and add the ship via and actually configure it. I'm going to switch. You can do it right here, but if you actually go back to the dashboard, we have, where is it? Shipping method. Is it the shipping method? Yep. It's through the shipping method here. You can add anything you want. So for this scenario, we're going to create a new shipper. We're going to call them demo shipper 1. We're going to give them a description. Supplier own shipper. And ship via number. You have to give it a physical number so the system can track it. We usually like to use the first letter of every, so it's shipper number 1 dash 0001. I'm just making that up. If you have a specific way you can actually track them, if the shipper has an invoicing type that you can actually use, you can use it here. It's just a way our internal system will start tracking it moving forward. So I'm just going to add it, and now it should actually show up down here. Okay, so I'm going to close. So I just added this shipper. So I'm going to create a vendor supplier that uses that shipper. So if I go back again to the add supplier screen again, and what happened is it actually will check the consistency of everything. It makes sure that, and you'll see it doing it, but once it is done, you'll actually see the demo shipper 1. So is that, hopefully that's clear. The shipper is the way things get moved to the site. Okay? Ship terms. I don't know if usually what happens is if you order, for example, through Newegg, you'll get an email, and this is for more or less if you're doing some sales on Amazon or some platform, Shopify or Newegg or some of these public front-facing stores, eBay, whatever. You'll get this timeline kind of thing that says package or label created, picked by the carrier, and so forth. This is the shipper terms. In our system, those are the shipper terms. So what would happen is anytime you do an invoice or a replenishment request, you actually have to tell the system at what time does it trigger the accounting. Does it trigger inventory replenishment when the shipping label is created, for example? That's the first option. Or is it when the carrier carries it? Let's say you're not doing, in this scenario, we're doing just demo shipper one, which is, we're assuming that's our own delivery. That's the vendor supplier delivery. They have their own trucks, for example. So when they, so here, the first option was the shipper label. Uh, if you were using, for example, FedEx or UPS or even postal services, either Canada or US, you can actually do when carrier picks up. So that's actually the trigger that will actually cause all the other things to happen, at least on the accounting side, on the inventory management side. Think of this as just the trigger for things to happen. If you're doing a tracking, this actually will initialize. So if you ever write a web interface using our APIs, and you want to actually know the state, the initial first step will actually show up in the API when the carrier picks up. So whatever the system that you have between you and the carrier, whenever they come in, pick up, and they scan something, and that goes into your ERP, that actually will be attached through our mapper to our system, and that would be the initial step. So you can actually write, for example, a web page that can show your manager in the site where things are. We actually have one, but again, it's just a scenario to explain to you how it works. Payment terms. The next one is payment terms. This is important. This is important for accounting. When do we actually deduct from the GL, from the general ledger, the cost of items? Is it at the end of workday? So if you issued an invoice for that shipper, do you calculate inbound, outbound costs, monies at the end of the day, end of workday, end of any day, end of the month, or on delivery? So those are usually the standard known payment terms that will trigger out our accounting. Order method. This is important. This is the only one that comes out of the box is invoice, and in a minute I'll show you how to actually create other order methods. Unfortunately for now, the only trigger that will trigger the accounting piece is the invoice issue. So if you actually print an invoice, that will start the ordering process. If you create any other order method, you're going to have to manually start, create a batch job or something that will actually fire up the process to actually do the accounting piece. The next one is Invoice Tile. We actually support multiple invoice styling. Out of the box, we support PDF type invoice styles. So, and I'll show you when in a second, once we create actually all the information. If you add an image, we'll use your company image to create the invoice and so forth. Another thing important here, the next one is import file format. If your vendor supplies you with their items list or their sales and quantity, the only thing out of the box we support is CSV. Now we do sell, you can purchase our SDK, in which you can actually write different parsers if you're interested, but out of the box we actually parse out CSV files, and we will actually give you the XSD layout of how they need to look. Since we're actually creating a vendor supplier, you're going to set yes. Now, one of the things that I actually would like to mention here is we actually do give you a list of every supplier of medicine in North America, that's US and Canada, and we give you a whole list. Okay. Now that list is not tied into the actual vendor name. So I can, for example, choose Aptellis here, select it, and I'm going to call Aptellis in Canada. What we will actually track is that name. That's to us the vendor name, not the Aptellis. It's just that list is actually just to help you if you're working with Pfizer or something like that. We have those listed here. So, but whatever name you give it, that's the name that we will track it moving forward. Of course, you can change the name later down the road. And once I save this, I will show you how. So that is the first screen out of creating a supplier vendor. Okay, I haven't used any other tab. And I can go down. I can go to the far left, right, the last tab here, standard in our applications, where it says finish and save, and you'll see the information that I put in here is created. So if I click on save, it's going to contact our cloud, and it's actually going to create it. And if you saw here, it actually put in a whole bunch of stuff. This is all the stuff that you can actually do now with that vendor. So this was the simplest, easiest, without having to fill a lot of tab information, way to create a supplier vendor. On the next video, I will actually go back and recreate that vendor, or a different vendor, but this time we will actually create the vendor and add a little extra information in the creation process. One thing to note here, in the vendor management, we have this sites vendor, and this is more or less an imaging thing, but remember we just created this Teliest in Canada. It was just added here, and you'll see it says ship via demo shipper 1, which is one we created. It says vendors also supplier. I have other ones created. For example, here they ship via FedEx, but the vendor is not a supplier here. And we will go and in coming videos we'll actually create more of these. But for now, as I said, this would have been the simplest way to create a vendor. Now, as usual with our application, you can always go back to our default desktop, and because it is the recently added vendor, I just created them, I can actually click on it, and it'll take the clutter out of my menu on the left hand side, so I can actually just work with that vendor that I just created. Of course, now you're into what we call the edit mode, the update mode. Since I only filled the first tab of the add vendor supplier, the data here is the only thing I have. If I go to the logo, for example, I didn't add a logo for this vendor. I didn't add any comments. No URL. We'll talk about these in next videos one by one, but this would be the end of this webcast. Our next webcast, we will actually create a little bit more advanced supplier vendor. Thank you very much for watching our webcast.